Well, the characters represent a sort of a transcendent feeling that we all have inside us, that we could do better. We want to do better. We haven't time to do better. That we can be the people that we lionize.
What is a monster? Is it a towering beast with glowing eyes or sword-like teeth? Is a monster a malicious person? It seems in real life or storytelling we use monster to label things we don't understand or don't want to face. Our traumas, disgust, insecurity, our fears. We fear what we don't understand, but we fear and resent what we refuse to understand. In denying ourselves understanding of something or someone else, we dehumanize it. We label it monster, keep it hidden in the dark, and keep moving on with our lives. One cartoonist, responsible for many of the most enduring characters in mythologies and comics and pop culture, saw beyond the fear of the monster. Through monsters, he explored human nature. His name is Jack Kirby. Born Jacob Kurtzberg on August 28, 1917 in New York's Lower East Side, Jack Kirby gained a love of storytelling when... Well, it's better if he tells you about his upbringing on Suffolk Street himself.
How much of Suffolk is in Yancey Street?
Oh, all of it is there.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah. It's all there, but so is the story. I come from a storytelling family. All of the immigrants on the Lower East Side were storytellers. My family happened to be Austrian immigrants, and they told their share of stories. And I think the young people were closer to their parents anyway at that time, and they absorbed all this. They absorbed the storytelling, and many of them use it to build a professional life. I don't mean as writers exactly, but let's face it, any businessman has to tell a good story.
Kirby took his love of listening to stories, reading pulp magazines, and watching movies to creating his own stories. As a child, Kirby was so invested in drawing and telling stories. There were times when he would get caught by neighbors drawing full murals on the wall of his tenement. Luckily, Kirby kept drawing and became one of the most influential figures in comics history. When you think of Kirby's art, you might think bombastic, anatomically incorrect, impressionistic, intense close-ups, big teeth, flat fingertips. But the kinetic shorthand of Kirby's work is what makes his stories so appealing. Beneath the blockbuster, imaginative energy of his comics, there's a deep-rooted humanity in Kirby's stories. He cared for people, and his stories reflected the empathy he carried for the world around him.
I've always loved human beings because they have the capacity to suffer.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yes, they do, and I try to make my characters human, whether we consider them evil or whether we consider them good. Mm-hmm. And even my heroes had human qualities.
When you read a Kirby comic, it's not just about heroes fighting villains, they're deeper than the superficial. Kirby shows us how we can be brave, explore the unknown, face the fears of daily life. And he understood that good, evil, regardless of appearances and faults, we're human. My name is Shaw, and welcome to Wit's End. Monsters are fascinating because they represent our fears and the fears of the unknown. It's not like comic books were the first place where monsters gained homes in our psyches. Books, movies, mythology, history tell stories of the physical and psychological beasts that plague us. The unknown, the other, is a concept humans have had in our cultural language for ages. But Jack had a deep understanding of monsters through his comic books.
Well, I don't think that monsters are ever mysterious. Monsters in human or inhuman form are living things with problems which vex them sorely in some way, and therefore they're inevitably involved in some sort of conflict in which anybody can get hurt. I don't think monsters zero in on anyone in particular, and I think that's why they're generally pitied more than feared. And I felt the same way about them. I felt that monsters in some way had problems.
Before Marvel's superhero explosion with the Fantastic Four in the early 60s, the House of Ideas would flood the market with tales of monsters. Intergalactic beasts, beings of energy, deformed people, prehistoric races, reptilian ravagers, what have you. In short, Marvel, via creators like Stan Lee, Dick Ayers, Larry Lieber, Steve Ditko, and of course Jack Kirby, churned out monster stories in books like Journey into Mystery and Tales of Suspense. These stories were filled to the brim with humans encountering monsters amid Cold War paranoia. That fear of anything different from the status quo. The other. Out of thousands of pages of monster comics, the notable story of the Blip, from Tales to Astonish number 15, shows Kirby's understanding of monsters. An air traffic controller tracks a blip causing power outages on his radar, leading him to a cave. He runs into a being of pure energy, but the being is from a peaceful intergalactic race. It's marooned on our planet, slowly absorbing electricity so it can return home. An angry mob tracks the blip and attacks the air traffic controller, causing the blip to fight in retaliation. The blip regains its power to escape, but issues a warning before it leaves.
Perhaps next time our races meet, you frail mortals will grow up. Perhaps then you'll be ready to join your brothers on other worlds, other galaxies. Until then, farewell.
Kirby talks about his fascination with monster books in his 1990 interview with Gary Groff, saying, "I always enjoyed doing monster books. Monster books gave me the opportunity to draw things out of the ordinary. Monster books were a challenge. What kind of monster would fascinate people? I couldn't draw anything that was too outlandish or too horrible. I never did that. What I did draw was something intriguing. There was something about this monster that you could live with. If you saw him, you wouldn't faint dead away. There was nothing disgusting in his demeanor. There was nothing about him that repelled you." Kirby goes on to dive into the fear of monstrous appearances in the Eternals in the 70s and Captain Victory in the 80s. The Eternals features the beautiful, godlike titular characters in their fights with the monstrous, grotesque, subterranean deviants. I won't be able to go into as much detail as I'd like with the Eternals, but I highly recommend that you check out those books if you haven't. Issues 8 through 10 of the Eternals focus on two of the most compelling characters in the series, Carcass and the Reject. One of them is a violent and hateful fighter with a high body count. The other is a peace-loving philosopher. I mean, look at them. No, really, look at them. Peace-loving philosopher, forsaken killer. Despite his appearance, Carcass finds himself at home among the godlike faces of Olympia, the mountaintop home of the Eternals. The Reject, however, is not accepted by the Deviants or most of the Eternals. Carcass and Reject, however, make a hell of a dynamic duo. As I'll mention later, Kirby had a knack for infusing characters with monstrous faces with hearts of gold. This next Captain Victory character, a book about an intergalactic military peacekeeping crew, not only has a heart of gold, but the heart of a lion. Let me introduce you to Terran. In the middle of a comic about intergalactic warfare during an invasion on Earth, Kirby makes a point about human rights and humans' fear of the unknown. Terran, a man-lion and soldier, helps to evacuate people during the enemy invasion. He rescues a girl in the chaos and returns her to her mother. Upon meeting her daughter Savior, the mother recoils in horror, but the girl doesn't. The following panels offer some of Kirby's most scathing criticism of human beings in relation to those they see as other through Terran.
"Oh, I tell you, ma'am, on my world we lions did the whole bit. Builders, inventors, conquerors, conmen, the good, the bad. But never the ugly, ma'am. Somehow, you Earthfolk beat us to that. You see, there's no such word as genocide on my world."
And Kirby understood this as he understood the horrors of war. Maybe he was coming from a place of anger. I've always wondered if Kirby's time at the drawing table was connected to his traumatic World War II experiences, but I personally can't say. Through his work, Kirby explains how looking normal doesn't matter when you're destructive. This quality about him makes Kirby a genuine soul, a fighter with a heart of gold who lacked superficiality. In a way, Kirby seems to be saying that humans are their own worst enemies. And we create enemies through stories so we don't have to look at our own reflections and be accountable to ourselves. When we fight each other, there's no way we'll be able to experience what's out there in the cosmos. Despite being of alien origin, we connect with these characters because they reflect our yearning for acceptance. But no matter how innocent the intentions, people will still fear the unfamiliar. The original Fantastic Four run by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee was one of my first comics, and it made me a Jack Kirby junkie. It made me obsessed with the medium as a whole. Marvel's first family's adventures through the unknown and Jack Kirby's mind-blowing imagination kept me coming back for more every single time. It's so disappointing that there hasn't been, a good movie made about the Fantastic Four yet. I'm not going to pay attention to the hype. I'm aware of the news, but hype can't pull the wool over my eyes. Anyway, when Reed Richards, Sue and Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm are bombarded with cosmic rays in space, they crash land to Earth. As they crawl out from the wreckage, their lives and comic books would be changed forever. As much as I want to, I won't be doing a deep dive of the Fantastic Four. It's Ben Grimm who I want to talk about, otherwise known as the ever-loving blue-eyed thing. Out of the four, Ben has the most horrific transformation. The other three still look like normal people except when they use their powers. Seconds after leaving the wreckage of the ship, Ben goes from chiseled jaw hunk to angry, deformed, rock-like golem. Early on, Ben Grimm maintained a bitter, resentful demeanor. The first time we see him in FF number 1, he's decked out in a trench coat and fedora. It's a disguise the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would pick up as their go-to disguise. Despite leaving monster comics behind, Kirby never stopped injecting humanity into his characters. Here's a chunk from Kirby's talk with Gary Groth, where Kirby says this. I knew the reader was never happy all the time. You take the Thing, he'd knock out 50 guys at a time and win. Then maybe he'd sit down and kind of reflect on it. Maybe I hurt somebody, or maybe we could have done it some other way, like a human being would think, not like a monster. A running theme through the Fantastic Four comics is Ben's insecurity about his appearance. The stares, gasps, comments, and being treated like the other take a toll on him. Even his name, Thing, is a jab at his disfigurement. But there are rare moments when Ben feels comfortable in his own skin, like when he briefly turns back to his normal self, or when he becomes the captain of a band of pirates in the past. It's not until issue 8 of Fantastic Four, Prisoners of the Puppet Master, that Ben finds someone who accepts him for who he is in the blind sculptor, Alicia Masters. Despite being the stepdaughter of a Fantastic Four villain, Alicia is a kind soul who finds nobility in Ben and lifts him up when he's at his lowest. The two go on to have one of the lasting relationships in comic books. The story of Quasimodo and Esmeralda from Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame reflects the relationship between Ben and Alicia. The 1939 Charles Laughton movie is one I highly recommend, but I'll use the 1996 Disney animation since that's the one people are more familiar with. In the movie, we're introduced to a deformed man named Quasimodo, which means half-formed. He's shunned by society and sentenced by his tyrant of an adopted father to live in the bell tower of Notre Dame, his only company being 3 gargoyles. Quasimodo's existence is treated like a crime. It's not until he meets the dancer Esmeralda that Quasimodo is treated as a human for the first time. Like Alicia's views of Ben, aka Marvel's Quasimodo, Esmeralda sees beneath the bell ringer's exterior, and she appreciates the noble and kind heart underneath. If there's any Fantastic Four story that's required reading for any self-respecting fan of comics, it's Fantastic Four number 51, better known as This Man, This Monster. As the issue that came after the Fantastic Four's first fight with Galactus, This Man, This Monster is quiet and contemplative. From the opening page, drenched in the rain of Kirby's pencils and Joe Sinnott's inks, we follow a man in a constant state of self-loathing. A scientist lures Ben into his home and steals the Thing's powers, making him identical to the Thing. His plan is to invade the FF and kill Reed Richards out of jealousy. It isn't until the scientist faces a life-or-death situation that he has a change of heart. The scientist learns that strength isn't about how much power you have, but your character. When he admits this to himself, when he admits his mistakes, he sacrifices himself to save Reed Richards, making Reed believe he has lost his oldest friend. The Thing's power isn't what makes him who he is. It's the kid from Yancey Street that people relate to. And Jack knows that. which is probably why we relate Ben Grimm to his creator. Jack even talked about it in his interview with Gary Groff. He was a tragedy. Can you imagine yourself as a mutation, never knowing when you were going to change and what you'd look like to your folks or people that you'd love? Everybody seemed to associate me with the Thing because he acted like a regular guy. No matter what he looked like, the Thing never changed his personality. He was always a human being despite his physical change. Ben Grimm always remained Ben Grimm. I think that's why the reader liked him, that touch of reality. You can't really change a guy unless you injure his brain or if he sustains some sort of injury in a situation. Ben Grimm might have changed physically, but he's still able to live a mostly normal life. The Thing might have had a tragic story, but none come more tragic than the Hulk. Gamma scientist Dr. Bruce Banner didn't expect the act of saving someone's life to change his life. But when he leaves the safety of his bunker during a bomb test to save a teenager, he's bombarded by the radiation of the Thing he helped create. This accident curses Banner to living an unending, waking nightmare. Themes from Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, Wolfman, iconic monsters of pop culture mixed with psychological trauma and Kirby crackle come together to create one of the most enduring monsters in any medium. According to Jack, the Hulk's creation came about like this.
I got my idea for the Hulk when I created the Hulk. My idea for the Hulk didn't come from any fanciful place or anywhere. It came from a mother whose child was crawling out from under the fender of an automobile to the sidewalk. The kid wasn't any more than 2 years old. And this panicked the mother when she saw her child under the car. And so the mother she ran to the back of the car and she lifted up the entire car from the back because she had that strength of desperation. And when I saw that, it suddenly dawned on me that there was a character there that's inside all of us, that when we become enraged, that we can bend steel. I've done that myself. And so, there it was, right in front of me.
Hulk's first issue, published in 1962, is part monster comic, part horror, part political thriller rolled into one. It harkens back to the monster stories Marvel published before the superhero boom. When we first meet the Hulk, we see a creature unwillingly brought into a world that already hates him. If you read those original Hulk stories, Hulk's hatred of humanity came from the hurt of rejection. The military hunted him for existing, and people see the Hulk as a threat. These are major themes in monster classics like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In the story, the monster means no harm, and only wants the acknowledgement of his father, the scientist who made him. Instead, he gets hunted down by an angry mob carrying pitchforks and torches. In the Hulk stories, he's instead treated like the destructive menace Mr. Hyde from Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novel. Misunderstood monster turned public enemy number one, regularly hunted by number one Hulk hater, General Thunderbolt Ross. But that's what the Hulk is. He's not even a weapon of mass destruction who causes property damage and terror for the hell of it. He's like a child lost in the world, trying to escape a traumatic upbringing. Kirby even draws Hulk like a gargantuan child. The Hulk doesn't want to fight and instill fear. He just wants to be left alone in a world that won't have him. Thing is, Jack had the right idea when he said we all have a Hulk inside us, because we do. We might not acknowledge it, or we shame it, but the mind state born of rejection, frustration, and trauma is there in all of us. Look beyond the blockbuster-sized property damage and monstrous features and you'll see one of the most human characters in comics. The Hulk teaches us to look inside ourselves and assess the damage before we cause any to the world around us. Glamorous and noble? Not really. But it would be one note if characters in fiction didn't have internal conflict. But Kirby created monsters who deserved to be feared. Before we go any further, I'm going to mention that Jack Kirby's creations, Doctor Doom and Darkseid, heavily inspired one of the most iconic movie monsters in history. Darth Vader. Half man, half machine, a regal yet ambitious authoritarian overlord of death and conquest who practices a dying black magic. Someone who leaves death in his wake but refuses to kill his own son, and yet he can still be redeemed. It's all there, and it all started with Kirby.
There are Dr. Dooms and Hulks in all of us. And if you read every one of your news stories, if you read any dramatic news story, you'll find there were human beings involved, and you can and you know as well as anybody else that there have been some pretty weird news stories in our times, and yet human beings are involved in them. And when you dissect the stories themselves, you'll find that they're not really dramatic at all. That the most dramatic part about them was that inside the human being, there are some sort of problems that we're constantly trying to solve. And I felt that my villains, as well as my heroes, were human beings, and therefore could have very bad problems.
In 12 pages, Fantastic Four Annual No. 2 from 1964 does the Herculean task of humanizing the metallic menace of Dr. Doom. No story does it better. Each year, on the anniversary of his mother's death, Victor Von Doom visits his mother's grave. He thinks back on everything that led him to this moment. In a flashback, we learn that Victor comes from a band of gypsies being persecuted by an Eastern European baron. Victor is the son of a village doctor and a sorceress. When Victor's father fails to save the baron's sick wife, Victor and his father go on the run. Victor's father's last act is keeping his son warm and alive in the unforgiving mountainous winter before he dies. Victor is alone in the world, and spends years getting revenge on the Baron and anyone who knew him with the use of science, engineering, and his mother's black magic. While Victor survived for years on his own, he becomes insanely self-reliant. Depending on himself is all he knows. So when a young Reed Richards warns Victor about the miscalculations in a college experiment, Doom ignores him. The consequence leads to the explosion which scars Victor, and leads him down a dark, resentful path. Victor travels the world and masters the secrets of black magic. He hides his shame by covering himself in smoldering metal armor, which scars him more. All for a scratch and a bruised ego, Doom takes his resentment out on Reed Richards. Despite his villain status, Victor returned home to Eastern Europe and became the ruler of Latveria. Turns out he's not a bad leader and cares for his people and rules peacefully. Doom is so sure of himself, he believes the only way the world would achieve peace is if he rules over it. And yet each year he returns to his mother's grave to find a way to save her soul from hell.
The guy in that steel mask is a very handsome guy, okay? He's a good-looking guy, but there's one thing wrong with him. He's got a scratch on his chin, and he's frustrated. He knows he's extremely handsome. He's got the scratch on his chin, but you haven't. And he says, why haven't you got a scratch on your chin? And of course, he doesn't realize that his own anger and frustration is mounting. He's not a bad guy, as you saw in a Fantastic Four. He'd give the Fantastic Four a wonderful meal before he'd kill them. So, Dr. Doom isn't all bad, and he's got a lot of class. He's got a lot of culture. Dr. Doom is a college man, and Dr. Doom is a knowledgeable man. And without that little scratch, which kind of ruins his own personality and supplies that lifelong frustration, that's what makes him the villain he is. And somehow we can't live with each other because of that little scratch. And that's part of maybe the what we call villainy and heroism. I can tell you that the gangsters in my own section lived very short lives. Not because they were villains, or not because they were different than anybody else. It's because they wanted that $200 suit a little faster than the average guy. And they were willing to do things that would put them in jeopardy and put everybody else in jeopardy. But I can tell you they were good to their mothers.
There's a specific scene Jack references in that clip from Fantastic Four number 87. In the story, the FF go to Latveria. Instead of killing them, Doom invites them to dinner and lets them go without a fight. A scene in Empire Strikes Back looks inspired by this moment, and I'd be surprised if it's not. Doom doesn't cause havoc when he doesn't need to. He can show mercy. Other Kirby creations are not so merciful. Take Darkseid, for example. First appearing in a cameo in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen number 134 in 1970, Darkseid went on to become the ultimate evil in Jack Kirby's Fourth World books, maybe even in comics history. In his run-ins with the Forever People, Mr. Miracle, and his son Orion, Darkseid searches endlessly for the anti-life equation. So when I read these Fourth World comics years ago, I thought the anti-life equation was just a way to snuff out all life in the universe, drape it in darkness. But at second glance, the equation's power is more terrifying. Darkseid is the ultimate authoritarian tyrant. He gains pleasure and power from conquest, control, death, and the endless pain of others. With the equation, Darkseid can snuff out all free will in the universe. No freedom, no difference in opinion, just blind obedience and the violation of everything that makes us human. Now, despite his misdeeds, Dr. Doom can and has been redeemed. But there's no redeeming Darkseid. Yet Kirby found two silver linings of humanity in the stone-faced tyrant of Apocalypse. They're thin lines, but still, Darkseid does not torture for the fun of it, and he refuses to kill his son Orion with his own hands. Like I said, Darkseid isn't redeemable, but he's been known to show some mercy despite his destructive, oppressive behavior. Forever People number 3 sees the titular cosmic hippies at the mercy of Darkseid and his lackeys. Instead of torturing them, he hands them over to Desaad, his right-hand man and, well, his torturer. In issue 6, Darkseid has the chance to kill the Forever People, so he blasts them with his Omega beams, seemingly vaporizing them. But we learn the Forever People were split up and beamed to different time periods, so they couldn't bother him anymore. Kirby characterized Darkseid as someone who won't kill needlessly. Darkseid isn't going to kill people when his goal is to rule over everyone instead. The depth of Darkseid's character comes through his interactions with his son, Orion, the main character of Kirby's epic New Gods. In a 1990 interview, Jack discusses Darkseid and Orion's relationship.
Now, in the New Gods, the core of that story was that a father will never hurt his own son. Now here I have Darkseid, the most evil character ever created. I can tell you, he was the epitome of all evil. All this fellow wanted to do was own everybody's mind and completely run the universe by himself. And you can't get more affectatious than that. But he couldn't control his own son. And of course his own son became his worst enemy. And there was nothing he could do about it. He was continually frustrated. And if you look through the books, you'll find that Darkseid, although his son is one of his worst enemies, and they have the fiercest of confrontations, that these confrontations will kind of destabilize. The situation would come to stabilize, and the father and son will somehow find themselves in other situations in which this confrontation vanishes. And Darkseid will suddenly find himself in some other situation where he can feel free to do his deviltry. And of course Orion will try to stop him. Orion is his son. And that's one of the truths that I always knew existed. A father will never hurt his own son.
Even Gods Must Die, a story published in 1984 after Jack had been away from his Fourth World characters for a decade, was the culmination of everything Jack had been building in New Gods. The challenge issued in New Gods number 1 would be answered. father and son would have to fight to the death. It's an encounter that's reminiscent of the Luke and Vader fight in Empire Strikes Back. Orion fights through the hordes and ghettos of Apocalypse, fights through hell to face his father. He plans to kill Darkseid, and despite fighting Orion, Darkseid won't kill his own son. Not by his own hands anyway. It's when Orion is most vulnerable that a firing squad riddles him with bullets, causing him to plummet to his death. As the story ends, Darkseid shows something that resembles pain and regret. He's not an evil overlord now. He's a father who lost his flesh and blood. It would be impossible for me to list every way Jack Kirby sought and portrayed the human qualities of monsters. He's too influential. And Jack's monster stories aren't the only ones that look beyond the exterior of the monster. From books to movies to animation, storytelling is filled with monsters. It's because they represent us in some form or another. But in a time when comics characters could be one-dimensional, Jack told stories that bled humanity and relatability. It was his art, love of stories, and the heart of who he was that makes Jack Kirby so everlasting and influential.